My name is Tom Friedman. I'm the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times. I'm the moderator for this panel, which I've been really looking forward to. It is, after all, the question. What will constitute, what will historians consider, Ukrainian victory? I'm going to give one more second, and then they can close the door. Because I want these people to have your undivided attention. We have a great panel. Professor Tim Snyder from the University of Toronto, Serhii Plokhii from Ukrainian history professor at Harvard, Yaroslav Hrytsak, professor of Ukrainian history, professor of Ukrainian at Catholic University, and Niall Ferguson, professor of history at Stanford. If you had asked me in 2022, 2023, I guess I'd have to put the two together, what's been happening in the world for the last 4 years, I would tell you that the meta struggle was that Ukraine was trying to join the West and Israel was trying to join the East. And Russia stopped the first, and Iran attempted to stop the second. That is, the United States was trying to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia to basically create an alliance of inclusion in the Middle East, and Ukraine was trying to join the European Union. And I was thinking, as I'm preparing for this panel, how much both of those projects are now stuck. But I have a lot more optimism about the one here than I do in the Middle East right now. The question before us is quite straightforward. What will historians consider a Ukrainian victory? And I should tell you that 3 of the members of the panel have been working on a Ukrainian history global initiative that basically traces Ukrainian history from the beginning of time to the present. And it's going to be a huge resource that future historians will be able to draw on. But I'm just going to start with a list I've got in no particular order. Tim, you're on my list first, so kick us off.
Okay, so it's wonderful to see you all. It's wonderful to be with you, Tom, and it's great to be with my colleagues and terrific to see Neil. I will just make some very general points, which I'm sure then friends will follow up on. The obvious overture, which has to be said, is that what is victory is in considerable measure subjective, which means that what is Ukrainian victory is going to depend largely on how Ukrainians and not us see the world. And this is an important thing to keep in mind because, like the war itself, the victory after the war or the situation after the war will largely involve Ukrainians doing things, our helping as we can, to create a situation in which Ukrainians can believe that this is victory. The second basic point, is that victory isn't only, or perhaps not even chiefly, about the precise way in which a war ends. I was in a factory in Nikopol a few days ago, talking to some workers, and one of the questions we posed to them was, "How are you thinking about the end of the war?" And one of them said something very smart, which sounds better in the language he was using than in English, but he said, "It's not about when, it's about how." And that's the fundamental thing. And if you're in the West and you're worried about the when, which is of course more of a Western concern, if you're worried about the when, what you should really be worried about is the how. Because the only way to bring about the when, the only way to get it to an end, is to think about how it can come to an end and how the world will look right afterwards. But the point that I want to make is that when we think about who won the Korean War, or even who won the Second World War, our conclusions have a great deal to do with economic and political cooperation, which allowed some countries to look much better than others, and some countries to serve as models for others afterwards. The final thing that I want to add to this is that although it's clear that we're going to be focused on the present and the future, the question of what a victory means for Ukrainians, I think, should be set in the context, and I'm just going to drop this and see if anyone else can help me pick it up, but it has to be set in the context of a very long-term history of Ukrainians in particular, but human beings in general, surviving rather extraordinary adversity on these lands and nonetheless being here. So this crisis is a horrible one, and it's tempting to think of it as the only one. But of course, Ukraine in the 20th century, sad to say, has been through worse. And the more you know about the history of Ukraine, the more you recognize that there were terrible axes, terrible conjunctures of world history which focused on this place, and yet humans and then Ukrainians got through. So survival is not the same thing as victory, but it is an element of victory. And although the past is dark and challenging, it also gives a foundation for thinking, yes, people can get through. And then, as I say, the critical question is, how do we create the conditions, how do we help create the conditions that will feel like victory afterwards?
Let me just press you just for one follow-up, Tim, because if you were to ask me this question, I would tell you there are two conditions that I think are necessary but not sufficient to be considered a victory. One is that a security structure is in place that Russia can never come back, or that would be they can't do this again. And the second is that Ukraine would be in the European Union, that it would have solidly become embedded in the West. Someone might say, well, yeah, but what about domestic Ukrainian politics? What if this is a corrupt government, but it's in the European Union and has a security guarantee? So I just want to press you on that. Like, it seems to me the criteria of victory has to do something with how it relates to Russia, how it relates to Europe, and what kind of internal political system is here. So I'd just like to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, thank you. I agree completely. The key word for me, the way I would summarize the point you're making would be the word sovereignty. That not a sufficient but a very important necessary condition for victory is sovereignty, where sovereignty doesn't just mean that the state formally exists, it doesn't just mean that it formally has borders, but sovereignty means some things that we can specify, like the ability to set your own domestic policy, the ability to write your own constitution, the ability to set your own foreign policy. And these objective markers of sovereignty are very important to keep in mind for, I think, politicians and thinkers and writers beyond Ukraine, both on the right and the left, who seem to think we're in some kind of post-sovereignty world where we don't have to take these considerations to heart. We very much do. The war reminds us of this. There is a huge difference for Ukraine if it is in a situation after the war where it is agreed that it cannot set fundamental aspects of its own domestic and foreign policy. Sovereignty also has a subjective element, though, this subjective sense among Ukrainians that they are the ones making the decisions. It will not feel like victory if that is not the case. And the subjective sense of victory will very much be related to your second point, which is integration with the European Union. As we've seen in Ukraine since, at the very latest, Maidan, European integration, although it can be presented as an incredibly boring, bureaucratic, legalistic subject, from the point of view of people on the outside, especially young people on the outside, it's essential as a way to imagining your future. Imagine the ability to design your future, which is something people took risks for in 2013 and 2014, and I think still are taking risks for now. And so the European Union sets an objective framework, agreeing with you, which allows two very important things to happen: economic cooperation and prosperity, but also reconstruction, right? If we think of the Marshall Plan as Reconstruction Mark I, which sets the stage for the existence of European integration. The fact of the European Union allows us to think about Reconstruction Mark II after what is, of course, a world war, or a war on the scale of a world war, in which only one country is actually resisting. But the EU also has this subjective component. If you are choosing to join it, then you are choosing to do something with your own sovereignty, and you're doing, and that is a step, I believe, which, aside from the important strategic points, which I think are behind your question, also gives people a sense that they are able to set the terms of their own future, which is about sovereignty too.
Great. Serhii, same question. You need to make, yeah.
One way to define victory is to think about it as the way to deny the enemy its objectives. And Putin keeps talking about the key underlying causes of this war. He points to NATO, but anyone who watched Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin knows that really deep causes of the war are in history, in Kyiv and Rus, and the issue that Ukrainians exist as a nation. So the goal there is actually to deny nationhood to Ukraine. And preserving that nationhood is absolutely necessary element of whatever will come and will be defined as victory. Without that, there will be no victory, and no historian probably would take responsibility on herself or himself to declare that victory. Ukraine achieved already a number of victories in battles in that war about nationhood and identity. The first one was achieved in the very first days of the all-out invasion, when Ukraine didn't fall. And Ukraine decided to resist, which from the point of view of history, and in particular European and East European history, was not unprecedented, but was rare and unexpected. The only guys who did that before Ukraine in the 20th century in Europe and didn't raise hands in the face of the almighty Red Army or Russian army were the Finns. They allegedly lost immediately the war, but they won in the long term, becoming eventually the only country on the borders of Russia that wasn't communist. Another victory in another battle, it's about the consolidating of Ukrainian nationhood and statehood, and the state that actually survived and continues to survive and fighting back in this war. The third one is Ukraine in the last 3.5 years produced more heroes and more mythology for the generations to come than the previous 50, 100, or 150 years, creating the foundation for the pantheon of heroes, for the narrative that would unite Ukraine in the way how the narrative of World War II actually not only didn't unite, but divided Ukraine. That's another third very important victory in terms of the, not in the war, but in these battles for nationhood and national identity. You can't preserve national identity long term without really building up a state that is sovereign. And sovereignty has been discussed here. I had a couple of points, but I will not comment on that now. I think it was covered enough. I just finish with comments on relationship between sovereignty and territory. A big part of this war, at least how it is understood in the West, it's about territory. And territory indeed is a very important factor in all this story. But if you place Ukraine in its geographic space, which is Europe, East Central Europe, over the period of the previous 100, 150 years, you will see that after the end of World War I, after the fall of empires, Every state that was formed there eventually underwent a change in territory. Look at Poland, look at Romania, look further west at Germany, what happened to Germany, and most of these countries are doing pretty well today. They won in the long run because they preserved sovereignty. So nationhood that can be supported only by sovereignty, for me, is a definition of victory, and I think that it would be at least part of that definition in the future. Thank you.
Yaroslav.
I do agree with what Tim and Serhii said, but I would just probably add some kind of a perspective, which is long-term perspective, and probably you know that historians find a way to talk about past in a meaningful way, not just play with example and cases, but apply so-called long-term perspective, longue durée. So my idea of the historical victory comes from the perspective of at least 400 years. And I would formulate it like that this is probably the last and the most decisive attempt of Ukraine to leave the Russian space and to join the West. This is the story which started in the middle of 17th century, when Ukrainians somewhat carelessly and mindlessly entered the Russian space, helped to build the space. Actually, they paved the way to Russian Empire as a world superpower, because they have some advantage in education and the quality of the elites, and you may know it or not, by the 18th century, half of all the Russian imperial elites were made by Ukrainians, so to say. In this sense, Ukrainians were playing a role for the Russian Empire like Scots did. They were paving the way for this empire because they believe they built their empire. But they built this empire according to their imagination framework, and they were referring to framework of the Polish state, which they left, which is federative state, which was limited of the central power, all the kind of things. So this was their idea, and by the end of the day, they failed, and they failed tragically, so to say. So I would say that Ukrainians started as a Scots, but finished as Irish, because they get experience that this is the wrong way to build empire, and they failed, so to say. So this is exactly the place. But this is only half of the story, because it's survival. That I agree completely. But you could not survive with such a predator, which is harder, so to say. You could not survive isolated, which means you have to enter in the larger space with some kind of alliance which could secure some guarantees. But it's also not just about the guarantees. It's about different way of structuring state and nation. What I try to say that Ukraine has to leave Russian sphere and enter in the West, but West which runs according to some kind of criteria, standards, all the kind of things. Here I may compare, also brings another dimension. I believe that Ukraine case is not unique. What Ukrainian issue was in 20th century was a Polish issue in the 19th century, very much so, because solution of the Polish issue meant reconstruction of the large space. And I would say the 20th century Ukrainian issue was much like a Jewish issue. There's irony that many leaders, if not more the leaders, founders of the Israel, was born in the Russian Empire, and many of them in Ukraine. And they brought this experience. What that meant to say, neither for Poland nor for Israel, it didn't come that easily. They started with independence, but it took them a long path to reconstruct, to reform their life, to enter into the Western space. And here, the last point, a large, very large active. What we're describing as a Russian Empire, as Ukrainian issue, as a Jewish issue, 19th century, as a Polish issue, is a common problem of so-called nations or people that lagging behind, comparing to some other space. And there are some theories, long-term theories, which try to describe what could be the trajectory, historical trajectory of their success. And basically, and name probably supposed to be mentioned, deserve to be mentioned. Name is Alexander Gershon, probably name some familiar to you, historian, economist from the Harvard University, born in Odessa. He fled from Lenin and Stalin, then from Hitler, so he knew this region very well. So what he basically says, that the whole idea that this country may leave the space slowly but surely, kind of snail strategy, doesn't really work. It's mixed stagnation. It's mixed stagnation, it makes the weak state, all the kind of things. It's exactly what Ukraine did for the first 2 or 3 decades of their existence. What he says basically, that the country could succeed when they apply different strategy, not a snail, slowly but surely, but frog leap, kind of radical changes. And the most important point comes here. He says basically this frog leap comes into time of the deepest crisis. This must be the revolution or war or some kind of other seed, because let's know, as our nature, we are really lazy. We don't do anything, but their life is simple and nice. There must be a crisis. So in a sense, I believe what is Ukrainian case is creating this kind of chance for the frog leap. And I would say this is another probably final metaphor has been given by one of the Ukrainian ministers under Poroshenko, that Ukraine has a typical problem of the last mile. Ukraine went very long run. It was a success, I would say. In terms of preserving sovereignty, the first 30 years, I believe, was a success. But the crucial is the last mile, because that's exactly where you have to make the most crucial, the most, so to say, decisive reforms. And this is, so to say, institutionalize some processes which would give this kind of frog leap. So my point is historically that Ukraine has a democracy by default for a variety of reasons because of history. The main challenge is how to transform this democracy by default in institutional democracy, which fits this space. And this for me would be exactly Ukrainian victory. Knowing from history that it takes a long time, I don't believe that this will be short war. This is for long. We may have some stop or some truces or whatever, but this is war would last longer until Ukraine get into space and secure its existence. Thank you.
Neil.
Tom, I want to begin in Yalta because I first began to attend this conference when it was held at Yalta. I received an invitation from Victor Pinchuk, and the reason I accepted it was that I just wanted to go to Yalta to see where Europe was carved up by 3 great empires without consultation of the people concerned. So if you think about 20th century history, I tried to write about this in a book called War of the World, the template of the nation state, which arises in really the late 18th century, which implies a homogeneous, more or less homogeneous citizenry, and a certain kind of form of government, was very hard to apply in Central and Eastern Europe for reasons that Tim and Serhii have written about. But over time, as a result of catastrophic violence, it became steadily more and more plausible that you could have a Polish nation state and it would be stable. And I think Ukraine reached that stage when it could be a plausible nation state. You can think of this as living through the Ukrainian Risorgimento. But I want to offer you a somewhat different typology of victory than we've heard so far. Because what we've heard so far is essentially, well, Ukraine gets to be independent, sovereign, democratic, we hope prosperous, and that's victory. I wish it were so simple. Because victory for historians really is all about duration. I mean, there have been plenty of little states and big states that have had those properties, but not for long. Victories can be very short-lived. My grandfather thought he had contributed to victory in 1918. The Great War for Civilization is what it says on his medal. 20 years later, World War II. So that kind of short-lived victory is not what Ukraine wants. Victories can be Pyrrhic. 1945 was victory for Britain, but it was Pyrrhic. Britain was broken by that victory. We don't want a Pyrrhic victory for this country. Real enduring victories, this I've learned from all the years I spent studying Henry Kissinger, whom you knew well, Tom. It's about military strength, of course, and the economic strength that underpins it, but it's about diplomatic security too. And that means legitimacy in an international order where you cannot be destroyed by a revolutionary power that simply says, no, this order's not legitimate. That's, I think, the key. Those are the key concepts we need to think about. Final 2 points. There are things such as non-victories. There are. Ties. Was there a victory in 1953? No. The Korean War was a tie. And there never was a peace. But look at South Korea. Wouldn't you like to be South Korea? Sure. Very dangerous neighbor. Not a border you'd like to spend time at. But South Korea is still here. It's democratic. It's sovereign. And it's had the most prosperous economy probably of the second half of the 20th century. So South Korea is an option that Ukraine could have without victory, with a tie, as long as it has what? It had and has what South Vietnam didn't have, because that was another tie that didn't last. Why not? Simple. No American boots on the ground, no American aid. Without those things, South Vietnam lasted 2 years after the peace of 73. I said to President Zelensky 3 years ago, you've got a choice between South Korea and South Vietnam. Do not be South Vietnam. But here's the problem 3 years later. The option to be South Korea has gone because there will not be American boots on the ground and there is no American aid anymore. So that puts Ukraine in a very, very novel position. It needs somehow to perpetuate its independence without what kept South Korea going. And that brings me from Yalta to Helsinki. The most interesting thing that I heard yesterday was from President Stubb. And President Stubb pointed out that Finland got independence, but not full sovereignty, and it lost territory. Finland's still here. Looks pretty good. South Korean good. This was a very profound insight, and it took me back to an article some of you may remember that Henry Kissinger wrote after the annexation of Crimea. Last thing I'm going to say, Tom. In 2014. And Arkady and I were looking at that article again yesterday. It reads very well. Because what Kissinger said was, if you offer NATO membership but don't deliver it, you put Ukraine in the most vulnerable possible situation. There will be a much larger war, he predicted correctly, and it would be better to agree now on a Finland-like outcome. I think we heard the exact same thing from President Stubb yesterday, and I think we need to ponder it very, very deeply and carefully. It's not exactly what Tim wants, because the sovereignty is qualified and there's territory lost. But it still beats being South Vietnam, which I fear is the alternative. If we tell ourselves that somehow or other security guarantees and aid from the West will keep the show in the road. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful, great, a lot to ponder there. Let me just throw out another question, and everyone can take a whack at it, and then if there's, and also react to things others have said on the panel. Is there any Ukrainian victory, and you really sort of raised this, it's implicit, I think, in something you said, with Vladimir Putin still in power in Moscow? That is, can Ukraine have a victory with Russia without Putin, or Russia with Putin? Well, I'll start with Neil, just come back this way. Let's do that.
Vladimir Putin runs a fascist regime, as has been said more than once. It's very hard to imagine any ceasefire or peace that would be anything other than a breathing space to allow the Russian war machine to regroup.
What about
on the other hand, Tom, I don't think one could assume that when Putin dies, and I doubt that he and she will get the eternal life they were hoping for, I don't think one can assume that if Putin, when Putin dies, he'll be replaced by somebody with a necessarily more benign view of an independent, sovereign Ukraine. So I this is the thing that, to go back to something that Serhii said. Oh, no, sorry, it wasn't Serhii. It's very difficult to draw analogies with the Scots and the Irish in this context, because the English ain't the Russians. And so you're dealing with a very, very distinctive problem that has to do with the Russian model of empire. And we're going to have to hope that regardless of who is president of Russia, that empire carries on crumbling, as all the other empires have. The question is just how fast does that happen? The faster the better for Ukraine. But that's the key. It's not who's president, it's whether the project of a Russian empire is leftover of the 18th and 19th and 20th century. So whether that project still has credibility for a generation, or whether, like the project of a British empire, it's in its last inning. I don't know, Tim, do you agree?
Yeah, Tim, take a whack at that.
I'm going to repeat, it's such a pleasure to be able to speak publicly with Neil and with colleagues. It's so good, and I'm so appreciative that we make this late session of the conference about the past, because it is a way to talk about the future. And we tend to be, well, not all of us, but we tend to be very modest about what we can say about the future. And yet it does turn out that historians are right sometimes about what's going to happen. In fact, I would take the predictions of the people on this stage against your top 4 political scientists about what was going to happen, right? So it's interesting, like reporters always ask us, historians are not supposed to talk about the future, but would you? And yes, we're not supposed to, perhaps, but sometimes some of us do. And I'm just going to point out that the track record hasn't been that bad, including about this war. I want to pull a theme that Neil brought up a little bit further, I think. And it speaks to Putin, Tom, but I'm gonna try to extend it back in time a little bit. This theme of durability, which I tried to drop at the beginning, getting through it, maybe as Neil says, not with an ideal outcome, but still being there at the other side. The point I want to make is that it doesn't make sense to just think about Ukraine and durability, because what happens in Ukraine will also be relevant to whether, as Neil says, Russia endures, but also, and this is why we are not spectators, it will be relevant to whether the European Union endures, and it will be relevant, in my view, also, whether Americans realize this or not, to whether the United States of America endures. It is very tempting to pretend that we are spectators, that we can choose to look or look away, we can choose to aid or not aid, that we have some place to go back to. But that construct of the state, even if you're a very big state, and this is something that history ruthlessly teaches, no matter how big an empire you are not alone. And somebody who seems smaller to you, who seems less powerful, who seems economically less advanced, can do you in. And so I want to turn the question about Putin around a little bit, because pleasant as it is, and necessary as it is to think of a world without Putin or a world with a different Russia, there is also the possibility that Russia will win. And I think not thinking about Ukrainian victory without that possibility in mind is pretty difficult. And Russia could win. History is full of examples of times when that state, which seems like a second-tier player with an irrational leader, nevertheless holds out, fights a war that seems crazy, but somehow wins that war. That's, by the way, why France exists. At the beginning, I mean, all right, I'm hoping that there's nobody here with culture générale who's going to challenge me. But at the beginning of the French state, you had 4 contenders. The one that was ridiculously small with a crazy leader managed to pull it out and become the beginning of the dynasty. That is how things work. Or a more familiar example, the fall of Rome. How did Rome fall? Rome fell because a group of people whose origins we cannot even trace, the Huns, managed to get charismatic domination over a group of people we vaguely remember, the Goths, and a Hunnic-Gothic combination did in the Romans. I'm using that particular territorial example because that is people coming from what's now Russia, defeating the state that was then in Ukraine, and that combination did in the Roman Empire. If you're the European Union, that should not be an unfamiliar example. I'm afraid that it is, but it's a reminder that things that last for a long time, and I'm going to submit that so far at least the Roman Empire is more impressive than the European Union, things that last for a long time can be done in by unexpected combinations coming from the East. And I give this example not just because it's a history panel and we're allowed, but also because I'm trying to make the point that durability applies to everyone, and that the Ukrainian victory question isn't a question we can watch from the outside, because if Ukraine isn't victorious in some broad sense, that means that it's unlikely that the European Union, in my view, is going to continue to exist. I want to also press the point a little bit about the relevant states around Ukraine and try to close on a slightly more optimistic note. And again, following some points that Neil was tossing out. If you are Ukraine, your historical neighbors are not just Russia. I share Slavko's long-term view about this, but the escape from Russia is deeply organically connected to relationships with two other European states, which are Germany and Poland. Part of the victory of Ukraine, its existence the last 35 years, has to do with the fact that Ukraine lost most of its traditional European opponents. You can criticize Polish or German policy, but historically, German speakers and Polish speakers were among the most successful at undoing Ukrainian statehood. The Russians are perhaps a late player in this game, just the last 400 years or so. And it's worth noting that what Poland and Germany do could, especially in the situation which I believe Neil is properly describing, I think precisely and necessarily describing about it with American absence, Poland and Germany become very important. And recognizing that Poland and Germany have roughly 1,000 years of historical responsibility in these territories, and that Poland also has a record of imperialism worth considering, and that Germany fought the Second World War in order to control Ukraine. Those are bits of history which can animate us to remember not just the European Union, but the specific responsibilities that Germany and Poland have towards these lands. So I'll close on that one. Thank you.
In order to make our discussion extremely frank and useful, I would suggest we have to discuss not only what victory means from a historical perspective for Ukraine, but what defeat means for Ukraine from a historical perspective. And it's touched upon the issue of Putin and also this kind of comparison with the Korean and Finnish case, because I believe they are strictly related. So in my imagination, or my knowledge, so to say, what is important about Putin, that he is obsessed with Ukraine. His attitude toward Ukraine could not be described by other word as obsession. And he won't obliterate Ukraine from political map. It's not about genocide per se, like what Hitler did with Jews, so try. It's just to deny Ukraine's state of nation, which means turn Ukraine, Ukrainians say, like in Russia, Yakuts or Chuvash, people who has no political separate ambitions. So this is the topic. Why I'm saying that? Because in this case, Korean and Finnish comparison, they do work and don't. I would say that we wish very much that Finnish solution would be feasible. We discuss it along in Ukraine and among intellectuals and public figures and experts, so to say, because crucial difference is Stalin didn't want to erase Finns as a nation. This is the most important point. Unfortunately. So since Putin is obsessed with Ukraine. And since this is very much his personal war, and since he wants to live, if not forever, but at least for the next 50 years, which means we are doomed to think in those long terms. And this is probably some paradox, but also opens some kind of the way for a hope. Because then we probably have to restructure, to rethink what Ukrainian victory could mean under conditions of the long war, which is still going on. And I would just turn your attention to the article written by the ex-minister ex-minister of Defense, Andriy Zahorodnyuk. He published this article end of June in Carnegie paper, so to say. He defines a Ukraine victory as a kind of technical victory or functional victory, which means, just put a very simple example, this would achieve what Ukraine did in the Black Sea. The war is still going on, but Russian Black Fleet could not function as a military, so to say, subject. So what this says, this may be repeated in the air, in the soil, in the diplomacy and economic kind of things. The war will be still going on, dragging on, but Ukraine will be changed, so to say, to the extent that Putin could not reach any of his objections and his political aims. So this is what he quotes, and I believe this very well because very apt quote, that technical victory of Ukraine is not just about survival. It's not about survival, but also survival, adapt, and achieve success, no matter how prolonged this war is. And here we have only one example, historical. Israel, not nowadays Israel, but Israel of 60, 70 years. So again, turn Israel, which has to be very much provincial, newborn state, in the state which power exceeds his size, startup case, or that kind of thing. So this is, I believe, this is exactly where we could reframe our victory in this kind of the long-term perspective. So to finish, as I said, our understanding of Ukrainian victory is to leave the Russian space and to come into the West as a new Ukraine, a very much transformed Ukraine, under which configuration, with which price, they cannot guess. But there is one condition. It won't be for short. It will be a very long time. So let's say this is something we believe we have to give an idea from historical perspective, that this must be kind of technical victory in the prolonged war. And if Ukraine will succeed, then we have a new tendency. First Israel, then Ukraine, and then probably may this tendency prolong for a new country which emerged in the post-colonial world.
Just 1 minute following up on this, because at there's the technical victory, but then underneath that is the obsession. And one of the technical parts of the victory has to be to help other people around the world to understand the obsession. But since this is a historical panel, I just want to make the point very clearly. Putin's obsession with Ukraine is not only his. The way that he talks about Ukraine is roughly consistent with the way that most Europeans and most North Americans were taught Russian history for the last 3 generations. So I would add that one line of the technical victory is precisely truth about history, because it's not the only thing that matters, but the fact that Putin's version of history is in some way believed or in some way plausible beyond the Kremlin and beyond Russia has hurt Ukraine and can hurt Ukraine in the future. So telling the truth about history is a way of, at least, if not defeating, containing that obsession.
Yes, I will talk about obsession also in a matter of speaking. So, first of all, I think that the only Finlandization that would work for Ukraine is joining NATO. For the only Finlandization, because I think that what we heard from President of Finland was a new incarnation of the old idea about Finlandization that would never work for the reasons that were described here, that no Russian believed that Finns were Russians, either before Stalin, Stalin, and after Stalin. So that parallel has some useful ways of being interpreted, but there are also limits to it. The idea of two Ukraines, like two Germanys, two Koreas, two Vietnams, also would not fly because we know what is happening today in the occupied territories. I'm going back to the same obsession. So Ukraine can be only one because everything else is being erased. So that place, in terms of its existing identity, would not survive for another 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. So either there is one Ukraine or there is no Ukraine at all. There can't be two or three. And one more thing about, again, related to that obsession is that one of the definitions of the victory is not just preserving the Ukrainian identity and nationhood and consolidating it in the form of full sovereignty or limited sovereignty, because that's what membership in the European Union really means. It's limited sovereignty, it's not full sovereignty. So, but also rewiring the brains of your enemy. Because the war very much is underwritten by the idea that Ukrainians don't exist. And while current war can really end with Putin, for whatever reason, leaving Kremlin, what he has been projecting is written in Solzhenitsyn. There is very much in the imperial tradition of Russia before 1917. And the only way to fix that is actually to defeat Russia on the battlefield. And I don't know how many people noticed, but in this current war, despite the fact that the idea is to destroy the entire Ukraine, the plans were never made to move into Western Ukraine because they are not considered and were not considered by Solzhenitsyn and others to be Russian. So if you don't speak Russian, if you have a culture that is distinct from Russia, and if you resist, as Western Ukraine did after the end of World War II for almost 10 years, the message is being delivered to your enemy and it changed its historical perspective. So I would add to my earlier definition of victory is also changing the way how Russia thinks and Russian elites think, because there is a long tradition of not recognizing Ukrainians, but we know now that there are ways of how to change that particular mindset.
Your points raises, to me, an interesting question of, can Ukraine win without rewiring how the American president thinks about Ukraine? And I'm very struck by, I was not here last year, unfortunately, but I'm just struck at how different the conversation is here 2 years later, that there's a missing person overhanging this whole conversation. And, you know, we like to say in America that, you know, the Chinese, they always play chess, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Well, we play checkers, you know. But Trump is actually playing Monopoly. He's playing a completely different game. This is a man who looks at the world where countries are good or bad on the basis of whether we have a trade deficit or surplus with them. So it's like a completely different framework. So just very quickly, because I want to leave a few moments for the audience, can Ukraine win with Donald Trump in power?
Well, it clearly has to. I mean, one of the reasons that we haven't spent much time talking about him is that I think he's really written the United States out of the script, and that's a reality that I've noticed people struggle to absorb. But it's clear that the aid is over, and anything that the United States supplies to this war effort, as I said earlier, will have to be paid for. Therefore, it's Europe's war. And maybe the way to think about this, and I want to pick up on something that Yaroslav said, is that Ukraine can't even be Israel, engaged in a kind of permanent military state of war, because that's conditional on American support, which Israel still has, even with Donald Trump as president. And you know this better than anyone on the panel, Tom. The United States sees Ukraine and Israel in very different categories. And so the Israel permanent conflict option, I don't think exists for Ukraine either. The only hope for Ukraine, in my view, is that its legitimacy as an independent state makes sense to the great powers. It doesn't matter what people think of your national identity. That changes over time. Italians had to be made. We've all taught 19th century history courses enough to know they didn't really exist as a nationality at the beginning of the 19th century. So that's, for me, not the problem. The question is there an international order emerging today in which it is in the interest of Germany in particular, but let's say the European Union as a whole, that Ukraine continues to exist as an independent state, and that military power that Ukraine has built up becomes a European asset? If that's the case, then it doesn't matter what Donald Trump thinks or what he tweets. I mean, the tweet today is a classic abdication of responsibility on his part, in which he says, oh, I'll impose sanctions on Russia if you all stop buying all Russian energy, and also impose 100% tariffs on China, which he knows full well isn't going to happen. So he's out. The issue is therefore, as I've said before, I'll say it one more time, does Germany believe in the Ukraine that we're discussing? Does it really believe in it enough to rearm rapidly enough to take the place of the United States? And I just don't know. I can see big changes happening fiscally, but I'm yet to see them happening strategically and in terms of military hardware. So that's the way I think about this.
Very interesting. Tim.
Yeah, I mean, a dimension. As historians, we've been talking about time in terms of duration, but there's also diplomats' time, right? The time of a day that's very full, the time where there are middle-term objectives to be achieved, but are you actually achieving them? And the way I'd answer the question about Mr. Trump is to say that he wastes all of your time. He's taking your time away from you. This whole European business of waiting for Mr. Trump to come up with something is a loss of time that you need for other purposes. And it is Mr. Trump's superpower that no matter how limited your expectations are, he will nevertheless find a way to disappoint you. And that is where you should start. So when there's a tweet which suggests maybe a change of mood, change of attitude, whatever it might be, you need to read it the opposite way. This is preparing you for disappointment. And you Europeans, I agree completely with Neil, starting with the Germans, have to act. You can't let the Americans give you an excuse for inaction. You can't let our bad policy be an excuse for your inaction. That makes no sense. And this is a historical point that needs to be made. The wars are won in many ways, courage on the battlefield, decisions to risk life, the willingness to fight, the willingness to start fighting, which I think about all the time. But the wars come to an end for economic reasons. But economics, and this is a lesson of the Obama administration, as well as the Trump administration, it doesn't act on its own. Economic power only acts if you figure out the way to turn it into political and military power. The Europeans in general, and the Germans in particular, not to mention the Norwegians, I'm looking for you out there, you have, okay, found one, you have sufficient economic power to help the Ukrainians win this war. It is historically strange that you have chosen not to convert it to political and military power. That is historically strange.
Serhii, I want to throw, we've just got a few minutes, I want to throw it out to the audience. Fareed.
I wanted to get the two Ukrainians on the panel, perhaps particularly, and you, Tom, to respond to the spirit of Neil's initial question, which was, what if Ukraine could survive with some compromises, the way the Finns made compromises? And I think rather than getting caught up in Finns versus Russians, what he's talking about is, could Ukraine take a deal where it accepts that it loses roughly 20% of its territory, maybe even 25% of its territory, which is Putin's demand, Donetsk, and has to agree that it will never join NATO? That would be my version of the Finlandization argument. So, and the question is, if it were to accept that and be able to become a powerhouse economy, a member of the European Union, the South Korea of the next 20 or 30 years, why isn't that a good deal?
Our Ukrainian panelists answer that.
Okay, I can start. That deal allegedly was already promised by Putin. We have nothing against you joining European Union as long as you don't join NATO. And then the entire annexation of the Crimea was about not just even joining European Union, but joining association agreement with European Union. So that deal was already offered and then violated. So if you don't join NATO, then there has to be some other form of assuring Ukrainian sovereignty. And then one can start talking about the territories. In the current incarnation, no NATO, and you get European Union, Ukraine had been already in that place and ended up to be in the middle of the largest war.
I'm following social surveys, and I would say that throughout the last year, there's a shift. Ukrainians would be ready and would be happy with such kind of the solution if it really would stop Putin war, because Ukrainians has concerns that Putin is not interested to stop the war, and they could go for years and years and years and years. So whatever we say, it doesn't really matter. I'm sorry to say it, it's a wrong question. We would be happy to have Finnish solution. We would be happy to, but we don't see it's feasible.
We only have 1 minute left. I'm just guessing one here and one there, Carl, and you, and just that's. I've been told by the moderators. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Roderich Kiesewetter from the German Parliament. Yeah. And on Germany, what do the Soviet Union, Russia, and Germany until 1945 have in common? Not to accept the right of existence of all of its neighbor states. What made Germany aware to accept the right of existence of its neighbor state? Unconditional surrender. Are we ready as democracies to fight against Russia? I don't believe so. Are we ready to create an atmosphere that Russia finds a similar way to an unconditional surrender? I hope so. So what, in your view, must be the condition to change Russia to accept the right of conditions of neighbor states? We have heard this the whole weekend, and I'm really confident that there is something. And on Germany, we have to overcome our complacency. We have to overcome the definition that this is a war between Russia, supported by China, Iran, and North Korea, against Ukraine. It's a war of these four countries against the rule-based order. And in Germany, we have the long lines of tradition, as you mentioned, 1812, Clausewitz supporting the Tsar against Napoleon, 1970, Emperor's army making Ulyanov to Lenin, and then as a gratitude, Soviet Union helping Germany to circumvent the sanctions of the Versailles Treaty. So T90 and Leopard have the same origins. My plea is to the historians, we have to change in Germany the mindset. We have the means, but what is your guess on how to change the German mindset by helping from our neighbors? Last remark, and that's important. We Germans say, never war again, never fascism again. Your lessons identified is not never war again, never defenseless again. And this we have to understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists.